Yeah, welcome everybody, welcome to my session. I guess you're all eager to know what the Rolling Stones, Frank Sinatra, and the Lord of the Rings has to do with Lightning components. So that's why you're here, right? So let's start with one of my favorite Rolling Stones songs, Sympathy for the Devil. So please allow to introduce myself. So my name is Christian Menzinger. I'm working for a German ISV partner called Apero. So we are based in Munich. So I'm in the Salesforce universe since 3.5 years, doing development. And I'm also co-leading the Munich developer group. And here on the right-hand side, you can see the company information. So also here you can find the GitHub repo where I have all my demo code for the slides done into the repository. So all right, what you can expect here in the session. Definitely we want to climb up the hill. So I want to give you some ideas how you could leverage the Lightning component framework to make your daily life as a developer even easier. So when I started working with Salesforce, so probably that is one remarkable thing, the first touch point with Salesforce for myself was the SOAP API. And right after that, I jumped into Lightning component development. So I missed the classical Visual Force stuff. And so I'm not sure if I have to, but right now I'm mainly focusing on Lightning component development. So I started with the early beta of Lightning components. And you know, daily life as a developer, you have different tasks to do. And one of the tasks is probably you want to call a server. So you have to get data from the server back. So you have to call a server-side action. And so what happened? I went to Google because I'm new to the framework. I want to know how it works. So I go to Google and say, okay, how do I calling a server-side action with Lightning components? So that shows up that search result here. It's the first entry, calling a server-side action. And that brings you to the developer documentation of Lightning components. So now my question is anyone here in the audience who have done this Google search and finding this code snippet? So please raise your hands. All right, anyone in the audience who did that more than once? So doing it twice or more often. All the others are really genius, remembering all that snippet about, remembering what you have to do, doing an action, setting callback, setting parameters, all that stuff. So this is actually one of the tasks you have to do quite often. And so that was my entry point about thinking how I can do it better than re-Googling all that stuff every time. And also when you're working in a team, it's probably good that you have kind of consistency. So you find this code documentation. So probably you start by copy and pasting this code. And then I ask myself, is this productional code? So let's have a look. So this is exactly the code snippet I showed you from the developer guideline. And you will find a lot of information there, like alerts, console logs, do something here. Typically you would, optionally you can. So there are a lot of marks that obviously this is not productional code. So you cannot copy and paste it to your project and actually you're done. So what's the problem behind? The problem is that every developer so far I know is a huge Frank Sinatra fan. Because every developer says, I do it my way. So you will probably implement it differently. From developer. So you have several developers, you will have multiple Apex calls in your project, you have different code locations to manage, you have a non-uniform error handling, so how you would respond to errors, show an alert, make a console log, use a toast, use an own component. So when you build a product, what we do, it should be like consistent. So you don't want to have an error on that part of your product showing this way, and you don't want to have an error on that part of the product showing differently because you have different developers doing different code snippets. And also, I don't want to re-Google that code snippet from time to time. So I want to get rid of this. So I have the challenge that different implementation leads to inconsistent behavior. And that actually was the idea. What I really need is one ring to rule them all. Okay, so I want to bridge this gap about, I want to have a consistent behavior. I need one code location, And the implementation must be context independent because, for instance, when I make a server call for contacts, I will receive a list of contacts, and I'm probably handling contacts differently if I do a second server call and handling opportunities. So I want to get rid about always copy and pasting the same code location into different contexts. And I don't want to fiddle around and do the same code again. So that was a challenge, and that brought me to that idea, okay, how can I face this challenge? So let's have a look. When you go to the code snippet, you will find actually 3 parts of the code which are the most important stuff. So this is actually the name of the server-side action you want to call, C server echo in this case. The second are the parameters you want to pass along to your Apex call. And the third one is actually the response. This is actually this part here. So you get a response from your action, so kind of you have some data back in your Lightning component, and you have to process the components. Here it's just an alert, but as I said, when I have contacts, I probably want to filter for contacts, or if I have opportunities, I want to set my attributes and my components. So at least these is what I would call the essentials of this code snippet. So this is the focus on the Apex function name, the calling parameters, and the return value. So these are the 3 parts we have to take care about. So when you go to the world of music, there's another quote, or actually it's an album from Frank Zappa, one size fits all. And so in my case, it isn't, because different server calls leads to different responses, as I explained. And so processing the response, so really what I'm doing with the kind of data, I have to filter, I have to modify, I have to pass, set attributes. This can't not really part of a generic approach. So we have to extract this part of processing the result from this template code. Also, my Apex calls, my callouts to Apex are all asynchronous. So I cannot directly write in the next line of code, say, here I make the request, and here I get the response, and I do something. So it's asynchronous. Also, this I have to take care about. And that leads me to that idea that I need a callback. So a callback is nothing else than saying, if something happened, if this is done, if this task, if the data has arrived, please invoke this function, and then I can process my data. Very theoretically, but you will see in the code, it's not that hard. So in my former Salesforce life, I would say, I have some experience in object-oriented programming like Java, and I knew that there is one of the paradigms of object-oriented programming. So a behavior leads always in kind of a method. So a method is described behavior of a class. So my first approach was getting rid of this problem. I using a helper function, I use a helper method to solve this problem. Okay, let's have a look about the flow. So scribble it down how I would process this problem. I have a Lightning component. Of course, there's a lot of things like a GUI, a graphical interface, then I have a controller, or I have a button, and this invokes the controller. But I will not just focus on the parts which are solving this problem, so not overload you with a lot of more code than necessarily. So I have a Lightning Components helper. As I said, I keep the rest away. And I have a method getContactList. So I hit a button, for instance, it calls a controller. And as you probably know, you should always do that kind of business logic in your Lightning component in the helper part, not in the controller part. You should do it in the helper part. Calling a server-side action is actually business logic, so you should do it in the helper. I named this getContactList. So the idea now is, instead of directly invoking the server in the traditional way as the developer documentation states, you can use a separate helper function. I named it callApex. My callApex is doing the call out. So this is really invoking the server-side action, the Apex controller, get contacts by filter in this example. And as you know, it's asynchronous. You have to wait. So the data comes back to callApex because it always comes back to where you invoke the Aura action. And then I have to use this kind of a callback. So my callApex has to get to another method that I can actually process my result. Remember, I cannot process it directly here in the callApex part because you do not know what data. When you want to be more generic, you cannot know about your data in the callApex part. You should be in a separate named part. And I called it getContactListSuccess. So this is the general flow about what I thought could be solve this problem. Let's jump into code. So what could be the snippet for that. So I took the original code from the developer documentation and put it into a component. That component is called V1 using helper method, and I'm in the helper part. As I said, all the codes are in our GitHub repo, apero_com, and so you can, and there is also fully functional code, so you see a GUI and you have a button and you can follow up the whole process. So here we only focus on the helper side. So I named this method call Apex as I showed you in the diagram, and then I just put the code from the developer documentation, except these 3 parts which we marked before, which we have to take care about the essentials, what could change here in the code. So I have instantiating my action, component get. I do not know the name of the method I'm invoking in Apex. So that's why I have to pass in this information as a variable, as a parameter to this function. So this parameter is called controller method. It's just the same string as you would hard code it in the classical way. You just pass it into that function called Apex. The same is true for the parameters. So you just pass in the whole set of your parameters into that function, and rather than rather than directly invoke the parameters here, you just use this action parameters. So, and now the probably hardest part of this code is the callback. So you can pass in a function reference, so just another helper method, and you have to invoke this function reference. This is actually the lower part. Success callback, because my variable is called success callback here, and then because I know it's a JavaScript function object, I can directly invoke the method like you would do with any other JavaScript method, and then you just put it into the parentheses. And then I put in response get return value, which is actually the actual response to my to the Aura action, so the data what my Apex controller sends back to Lightning component. So this is, as I said, the trickiest part for now. And when I invoke this method, and I think your presenter has stopped working. Okay, here it goes. So I have to invoke this call Apex method. So as I said, I come from get contact list, and then I just pass in all the information we had before inside that code snippet. And this is actually the get contact list by filter, which is the method name. Then I have an object filter string, and then I have to name this callback method. So the remarkable thing here is that here on the top, this get contact list success, I do not use the parentheses here. I'm not actually invoking that method. I'm not calling it directly. I just use the object, the function reference, because I call it later on in the lower red section. Then I'm invoking it and passing by some data. So this is a concept, it's a kind of strange, but actually that works out very well. So the only thing which is missing is get contact list success. It's the same helper. So I'm just scrolling a little bit down. You see it's just getting the data into that function. And then on the lower part, I just define this method, get contact list success. And I defined, because it's my function, I can define whatever I want to pass to this function. Component reference makes sense for all helper methods, and then I have the return value, the data I'm actually focusing. So the data really comes back from my Apex class. And then I can do processing my data, whatever I want to do, set an attribute or modify the data from the server. So this is the idea for the first approach, which works out actually. So it's running, we can run the code. Everything works out, no errors. I can get the contact list. But what have we achieved so far? So how far do we get? So we can use call Apex for a second server call. So for instance, so this is the construct we have already. I have the contact list, I have call Apex, I go to the server, I get the data back, and I can use the same construct within the same helper for another server call, for instance, get opportunity list. And then I have another Apex controller method, which is probably named get opportunity by stage, and then I get back my data. So I have a reusable code within that helper. But as I said, one of the problems I'm still facing is it's only possible within the same helper. It can be reused, but only within the same helper. And probably sometimes if you have a service layer architecture in the background, you probably have different components facing different kind of data, so your contact is probably not the same component as your opportunity component, and so you want to split them up. And so if I want to use the same approach in the opportunity component, I have to copy the code again, and that's actually what we wanted to avoid. So we need another approach. So I thought about reusability. So how can other components use this abstraction of an Apex service? This is actually what we built. We built an Apex service, which I can reuse whenever I call an Apex class. So you have to encapsulate functionality. I mean, that's also a paradigm of object-oriented programming. It's always good, encapsulate things into own things. And you know probably that when you look to Wikipedia, a class is actually defined by extensible program code template. This is the definition of a class. So my idea, we could create an abstract base class where other components can extend from. So what is an abstract base class? Abstract just means that you do not directly instantiate this component. So it's more kind of, I have some code over there and someone else is using it, but I'm not using that code standalone. This is what abstract means. And we can have the same, so you know it in Java, abstract class, for instance, you can have the same construct in Lightning Components. So I can create a component, which is kind of a new template, and then I can extend from that template and use it. So that was my idea. In the abstract class, I only need the helper, because that's the one, the one business logic part. So I have an abstract Lightning component in the helper, and in the helper I define this method call Apex. So when I now use this abstract class, I have to extend the component from this class. So it's kind of a template, A class is a blueprint, and then you extend it, and so they use everything from this base class in the concrete class, we would name it. So you just extend this, and we have the same flow. The only difference is actually that my helper method is not calling a method which is defined in the helper, it's just calling the helper method in the abstract class. We will see how this looks in code. But this is the overall figure. So I have an abstract class, so the call Apex method is somewhere behind, somewhere in this template code. And then I go to the server, go back with my data, have a callback, and then I can process my callback. So this is cool because I can extend this class in multiple components without touching this call Apex method again. So you can just extend as often as you have to use. So another component is dealing with opportunities or contexts or cases, whatever. So you're just extending the same base class. So let's create an abstract base class in Lightning Component. This is really, really strange. This is really hard code. The only thing what you have to do is actually abstract equals true, extensible equals true. And then you have an abstract base class. That's easy. The only thing what you have to really recognize, and remember me, you will forget, because it happened to me a couple of times, is that you have to define v.body. So I'm not sure how familiar you're with the concept of facets. Every component has kind of a container or a placeholder for all the markup you create in a component. So if you're not familiar with why you have to use v.body, you have to Google for facets in Lightning Component. That explains a little bit more how that works. So for now, we just remember doing v.body and doing abstract equals true, extensible equals true. That's all for now. So then I can use a helper method, and I do not need a controller because, as I said, it's just a template. I would just want to use this in the background. And so what I'm doing, I just copy and paste what we have in the v1 component. So the call Apex method has not changed. I just use it from the previous example. Just put it over there. So I just put it in another code location. Now I have to extend this base class somewhere in my code. Also, this is terrible code. I only say extend, and then I have to name whatever you want to extend. Probably this one thing to remember is that you have to use the namespace, the full qualified name of your components. So the same as in markup, you remember whenever you using, for instance, a lightning button, you write lightning button because the button lives in the lightning namespace. If you create an own custom lightning component, you write C my component name, and C stands for your custom default namespace. So it's just a default in your org. If you're using a managed package, you probably have a namespace, so you would name it whatever your package's name. But for now, C is actually fine. So we have, again, a look at the controller. And it's exactly the same controller as we had in the previous example. The only difference is that the call apex is no longer in this helper. So we just cut this off, put it in the abstract base class. And now I can use this.call apex. And you see, this is the full helper. You cannot see call apex anymore because it's in the implementation of your base class. It's a little bit kind of, well, maybe strange, or it does not make it easy to read the code, for sure, because you're calling something you do not see. But this is actually what happens through inheritance. That's the way it is. The rest is the same. So my call apex, I'm passing by a callback method, and the callback method here is, again, get contact list success. So far, so good. So how far do we get? I have a generic component. I have no hard-coded dependencies anymore because I'm passing in all the information I need through runtime. So my abstract base component does not need any, or has no hard-coded things. He does not know about the controller method. He does not know about the data. He does not know what you're returning. It's just a man in the middle. It's just a bridge. But that leads to that I have a real reusable component. You can, whatever you want to have this, use this component, you can extend it in several other components. So for instance, component A is handling with contacts, component B is handling opportunities, component C does not do any Apex calls, so it has not to be extended. I don't have to use this abstraction of a service layer. And so probably I have component D doing handling with cases or whatever. So this is actually quite good. I still have a problem. One does not simply extend multiple classes. So the problem is still extension is one-to-one, inheritance is one-to-one. I cannot extend multiple classes. I cannot say extends component A, component B. There's a difference between inheritance and interfaces. You can implement multiple interfaces with a comma, but you can only extend one base class. And so you're facing probably that inheritance is already used. So I'm already extending another component, so I cannot extend my component. Okay, so if this is the component and this is extending this component can still extend my base component. Yes and no. If you're not the owner of this code because you're using another third library or a third-party component, for instance, you cannot force the guy to extend your component that you have an inheritance chain one-to-one. So this is actually, it can be done, but it can also be that it can't be done. And so again, there is one of the very big paradigms in object-oriented programming, favor composition over inheritance. So what does this mean? What we have implemented so far, or what we have done, is actually we talking about that my component, for instance, this contact list component, is a service component because I have extended something that makes it a service component. But what we really want to have to achieve is that my component has a service component. So it's just using another component. Use as many other components as you like, because that's how the framework is designed for. Composition that's how the framework uses. When you write your markup in Lightning Components, you have a lot of single components you're instantiating. You're using a button, you're using a card, you're using whatever. That's all composition. And so I use the same technique for my own service component. So I create another service component, a real component. So it's no more an abstract class, so I create a real component which has the helper and it has the call apex method. And I have another component. So the one thing which is missing, the missing puzzle actually, is that helper from component A cannot directly call a helper from another component, because that is against encapsulation. So the Lightning Component framework prevents that you are inside your component to execute something in another component. Of course, there's an exception, and the exception is called API. Everything which is allowed by the framework is part of the public API. So you know it probably from Apex, when you write a private method, you cannot invoke the private method from another Apex class. If you make it public, you can call it from another class in the same package, because by marking it as public, it's part of the API. And so the construct what we are using in Lightning Components is called Aura method. I have public attributes, obviously. I have like events, what I can register, and I can use methods. So when I define an Aura method, then it's kind of the part of the public API, and my component A is not directly calling the helper method. I have to call this Aura method declaration, and then I can process this call to my call Apex method and get the data back. So this is the flow actually. Component A calls Aura method calls the helper is calling the controller, the callback comes back to the helper calls the callback function in the component. It looks a little bit over-engineered, it looks a little bit hard to do, but at the end it really pays out. Because if you have done this once, you have that one component and you can reuse it in every single project because it's totally generic and it helps you for every future project. You have never re-googling this template code and you can improve this service component. So you can use it as many times as you like. You just have to name it in your markup and that's it. Okay, let's have a look at the code, how this looks in the implementation. So again, when we look at the previous example, we had this extensible and abstract stuff, and we had this vBody tag. No need for that. We're creating a real component. So we just use Aura component, and that's it. Nothing else. Now we have to define the Aura method. And also this has to be done in the markup, which is a little bit strange, because I define a method, and I'm used to define methods in Apex, in Lightning, but I have to do it with markup actually. So how does it look like? It's Aura method. You give that element a name. I can use call Apex here as well. Has not to be free choose name. And as every event happening in Lightning Component, it is handled by your controller. In this case, it's called onCall Apex. When you call a method, you have to define parameters. And we have these three parameters we already know: controller method, actions parameters, and success callback. And I have a fourth parameter, the component reference. I come back to this because this is the hard part in this example to understand. So I have this declaration, and what happens under the HUD is whenever you call a method from the outside in that component, you call this Aura method, it's the same as an event would happening in your Lightning component. So you probably know when you have a button and you say on click and you write a controller method, then you always have three parameters passed by in your controller method. It's always the same three parameters. It's component, event, helper. Okay, so this is kind of strange because I defined a method and I defined four parameters, and then I write my controller method and I got component, event, helper. That's how the framework is designed. It's not directly invoking this on-call Apex function. It's just, using a mechanism to invoke or collect all the data into an Aura event. It's just how the framework works. Whenever you write controller methods, it does not matter from which event it's triggered. It's always component, event, helper. Always the same three parameters. It's really prototype, a boilerplate code, always the same. And so how I can get the parameters I defined in the Aura method, you have to do event get parent arguments. Of course, you can also Googling this in documentation for Aura method. And then I have an object params, and then I have all the parameters I defined. So params.controller method, params action parameter, and so on. The only thing which is you have to make sure is, remember, you want to invoke a callback method which lives in another component. And so I need a reference of this other component, otherwise I won't be able to send the data back to that component. And that's why I have a fourth parameter called caller component. It's nothing else than the component reference from the original component who invoked this method actually. And I just put all the things together and put it into my helper method. So in the helper method, I define all my parameters here, and then I do exactly the same as before. So I have the call Apex method, so it's not changing anymore, all the same code. And now I really want to use this component. So how can I use another component? No, just define it in the markup, as you do it all day long. So I just say C colon V3 service component. I give an ID for that I can reference it later on. And so I already used it. So when you want to invoke this call Apex method, which lives in that service component, you have to reference the service component to invoke the Aura method. And so component find gives you that service component instance. And then you can say call Apex, because I named the Aura method the same way as my helper method, so probably confusing over here as well. Aura method, and you have a name, and that's the name what you have to do calling over here. And again, and then I just pass in all the data I know. Because here I'm in the concrete implementation, I know that my server-side method is called getContextByFilter and all that stuff. So you're passing in all the information to that service component. And I'm also passing in the callback, as we had in the previous example, and the callback is just defined in the same helper. That's actually the heavy lifting. I agree it's kind of effort to build this along, and you will do mistakes in the whole chain of this calls this, and here I have defined this. But at the end, it really pays out. So, as I said, when you build a product, you have a team of developers. So if you spend the effort once, every other team member can profit, because the others don't make mistakes, because the only thing they have to remember is that you have a service component and they have to remember that call Apex and they have 4 parameters. That's all they have to know about how I would invoke a server-side action inside my product. So when you have done this work, then you really can feel like a champion, and then you can really involve this service component. So nobody's gonna slow me down. So now you really can spend effort to improve your component. So what you can improve, for instance. So you can, for instance, improve the error handling. As I said, the template code we used so far, there was a lot of things like probably console logs, alerts. So now you can implement a proper error handling. For instance, building an own a modal component showing the error, or you're using the Aura toast messages for that. But you have to do it once at one place. There's just one code location. And whenever you're improving your error handling, everyone in the project automatically gets these changes. You can also, for instance, add a spinner. So whenever you make a call out, automatically a spinner is shown. Or you can lock the GUI, or you can add storable actions, which helps you to improve performance to reduce server calls. So this can all be done in this one service component. And this is actually what the benefit would be from this whole procedure and this whole stuff we built. One thing from my experience, do documentation. Because when you build a reusable component, you want to have that all other people can reuse your component. And normally, they should not look into your code that they understand how they can use your component. They should look at the documentation and get an idea how they could use it. So you have to spend some time on documentation. Also, another word, in my experience, when you build, this is a very simple reusable approach, because we didn't have a GUI. When you have a GUI and you have styles and you have hierarchies of diffs and whatever, it even makes it more complex to build real generic components. And so it always takes more time to build a generic component than you build it for your certain use case. So it's your responsibility to make a decision. Is it worth spending time building this construct, spending time in documentation, spending time in thinking about how I really make a generic component? Is it worth or not? And there is no answer, because it depends. For a call Apex method, or for something which calls my server, definitely it's worth, because you will do this a lot of times. So it's a real reusable component. So what's the conclusion? What's the way to go? Build more components. It's really, we have hundreds of Lightning components. We have huge amount of lists because that's the framework how it is designed for. So you have to identify recurring tasks or code you have to copy and paste along different locations. Whenever this happens, think about how you could use all these methods about using an abstract class, using inheritance, using an OR method, maybe an interface, whatever, so you can really pull the strings and create a new component helping you in the future. You have to be generic to really be reusable. So when you are generic, that means there are no hard-coded dependencies anymore. So you just have to pass in all the information you need at runtime. And as I said, inheritance can be good. We use it also in our cases, but it's not always the best choice to use inheritance out of the box. So also here, make a wise decision. When you use inheritance, you need really good reasons for it. Otherwise, favor composition. So this is the way we went. And so I have another slide with all the resources for what we had. One tip, or actually one guideline, which does not have something to do with Lightning components, is, as with every other technology, fiddle around, make mistakes, RTFM, read the fucking manual. Chat with others. And so one of the good reason or a good opportunity to do, of course, you're on Dreamforce, so share your problems. Also share or join a local developer community. So you know probably on developers, salesforce.com, you will find all the communities worldwide. So I'm leading the developer group in Munich. So if some German people are here, you're very welcome to join our meetings. Also, we have a fireside chat at 1:15 this day, so right after the session, more or less. In the community curve, there are other leaders from other European communities here telling the experience about what's the benefit about connecting, what's the benefit about meetups with other developers, women in tech, non-profit groups. So there are so many groups, so it's really worth sharing the problem. Are there any questions to that specific problem? So please, when you have to go here to the mic, because for the recording, everyone can understand it.
On the method service, I just wasn't clear. Are you calling the service that calls that does your method? Is that happening from a controller class, or is that also happening from a helper class? So you basically going controller, helper to method to controller to helper? Yeah, you always come from the controller, then you go to the helper, and then in the helper or in the actually call out to the Apex class, you have the function reference. Yeah. So then you're directly invoking in the other helper. Because I just wasn't sure if your method was actually happening in the component controller or actually in the helper. Yeah. So that's where you're invoking the service from. Yeah. And the second, was there a reason you went with a named function over anonymous function in the 2 layers up?
I prefer name functions, but I think there's no difference.
Okay. I just was wondering if there was a philosophical reason there.
All right.
Hi. Hey. Have you tried exposing services component inside a managed package?
Yeah, it is in the managed package. It's in our product. So we have, as I said, we have involved this component. So we have a lot more things. We have a really sophisticated error handling, because this is probably a good tip. When you look at the documentation, they just check the OR action for an error. But what you get back from the server is not as sophisticated as you would handle the server on the Apex side. Mm-hmm. So the Apex side, you have a more sophisticated error handling. You can have try-catch, you can have custom exceptions. So what we do, we always have success. Whatever happens on the server, and then we have an own error object we're sending along to the client. And then this is also built in that service component. And so we can handle all different cases in a service component. We have to do it once, and we have very sophisticated error handling. And it works in a managed package, for sure.
Right, thank you. And did you face any issues with Locker service, or since you're not using the DOM?
Because this is all Locker service compliant. Right. The strange thing, probably, if you know how Locker service works, is that another component invokes this component, this invokes it back. But because the original call comes over here, they know each other, and they're Locker service compliant to pass along and callback. Otherwise, callbacks is just the preferred way how you deal with that.
All right, thank you very much.
When you are returning the value in the favor composition, when you are returning the value to the original method, you are just passing two parameters. One is the return value, and the first one is the component, right? And you are referring to them in the original method. So, I mean, how does the original one refers that you are calling to the its own component and not the one that you are sending from the favor composition method, the abstract one?
I did it here.
I mean, it should be an object that's.
Yeah, so here I have call a component.
Yep.
And then I just use this as the first parameter.
No, the last one, the success callback. So this is the method that you are calling in the, this is the method that you would be calling in the original component, right?
Success callback is actually, I need to define where I come back actually. This is where
in the original component.
Here it is, here the line is actually cut off. It is on the fourth parameter here. So this will be the reference to this function here in the concrete implementation.
So I mean the point I'm having is like you have two parameters over here. One is the component and the one is the return value, right? Not sure if you're getting my question. What I'm referring is like you have two parameters over here, the component and the return value. If you move on to the, can you move back?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And over here, you are returning these two. This one. When you are calling the success callback, you are returning the component and the response value.
Yeah.
So this component should be referring to the
caller component. Okay.
Yeah.
Probably it would be more clearer. That's probably a good improvement of this code if the first parameter would be named caller component because I'm passing in the caller component as the first parameter.
Okay,
that's probably where the misunderstanding comes from. Yeah, sorry for that. All right, thank you very much. Probably we see you in the community CAF and have a good day.